the complement of the conclusion of that study. Because if the replication studies are any indication, the attempts to go around and replicate psychological studies, things in the social sciences more generally probably follow the same trend, or at least I suppose that they do follow the same trend. But in any event, this happens in the social so-called sciences, not so much in the hard sciences. They will overstate their conclusions. They will misleadingly state their conclusions, or the conclusions will just be absolutely false. And this is all brought to you by the convenience of not adhering to so petty a concern as scientific rigor. Now, when a person is citing one of these psychological studies, you can, for even better reasons, believe the complement of the claim rather than the claim itself, because the people who propose these propositions generally are doing it to support a politically driven agenda, a politically driven ideology, as she is here doing. So when they go to the list of things that would be convenient to use that we can call science list, and they look at it, they will select from these studies, which, as I mentioned, are already dodgy on their own, but that dodginess is non-linearly magnified by the selection criteria of politically active ideologues, and demagogues, incidentally, but putting that off to the side, who want to use these to push a particular social narrative and indeed to control your behavior. Now, on to the actual Sapir-Whorf little thing that she mentioned. I did go Google it. I would think that as a neuroscientist, that before you go advising other people to Google your work product and to see whether or not it's true and the extent to which it's valid or invalid, that you yourself would have done so. And if you did do so, you would have noticed, as it appeared on my screen, that the first entry is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which a hypothesis is not science. It is not part of the ex cathedra program or enterprise of science. It's something that it sounds reasonable, I suppose, or at least something that's interesting to be looked into. And then you go to like Wikipedia, and Wikipedia calls it the Sapir-Whorf theory, which has two forms. The strong and the weak. The strong form is that it's deterministic. These linguistic categories about which she's here repining determine our behavior and worldview. And then the weaker version is that it greatly influences the aforementioned properties. Now, the problem here, doctor, is that they did this little thing called research in the 80s, where they positively showed that it's not deterministic, and that the influence, whatever it is non-trivial, which is a far cry from a great influence, and that is restricted to only a small number of domains of mental life. It doesn't generalize. Now, the curious thing here is that they had to do research at all, experiments at all, to reach this conclusion. One of the great things about science is parsimony. Lex parsimoniae, Occam's razor. Or Einstein's razor, as I prefer, because it makes explicit what's implicit in the idea of parsimony, that you make things as simple as you possibly can make them, but no simpler. Or, as Einstein actually said it in 1933, from which this paraphrase is taken, the actual quote goes something a little bit like this: "It can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of science is to make irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without surrendering a single datum of experience." So the idea there is that you take account of everything that is known, you sacrifice none of it, and then what you do is you prefer the simplest explanation based on previous knowledge and whatnot. Now, here we have to remember that we're talking about social creatures which are evolved. And it does not take a great intellect to realize that we have behaviors that we still engage in that precede the existence of language. So whatever else is true about this hypothesis, the one thing that cannot be true is that it's causally related to what it is that we do, because we have behaviors that don't depend on it and predate it. That in and of itself is sufficient to say that the claim that those put forth by Sapir-Whorf, that this claim about the determinism of it is just false. Now, it may have some influence, which is harder to test, and one of the things that happens very commonly in the social so-called sciences is that the way they go about doing these so-called experiments is they devise them in such a way that it's not possible, generally, to distinguish between a measurement error of the instrument that they're using, the diagnostic sensitivity of the instrument which is being used to measure the thing, and an actual event. So that's why I'm dubious, to say the least of it, whenever I get told these kinds of things. So I would think that after 30-some years, 30-ish years of it's being known that it's not deterministic, that it doesn't cause this, that you wouldn't go around saying that it changes it. Now you might say that it's not that it has some influence here or there, but that's not a cause. It's neither necessary nor sufficient. It's a contributing factor in a minority of mental exercises, but that's not your claim. Your claim is much stronger than that, and has been, one is logically dubious on the deterministic front, and on the great influence front has been shown not to be evident when you actually go look at it.
It's science.
Oh, and real quick, all the great minds who really put forward the enterprise of science realize this notion of parsimony, and they take it very seriously. And Einstein was a great example of it. There are many others. I'll give you one other. Personal hero of mine is Richard Feynman, and the way that he really got the goose of helium scientists who were really getting confused about superfluid helium. Leonard Susskind has a talk on this about Richard Feynman, is basically a eulogy on TEDx, but he talks about what Feynman did. And what Feynman did is he bested them all using his own diagrams and being essentially Richard Feynman. And what he did there is something that is an exercise that we teach to students in calculus right away. It's something you pick up very early in your calculus career about using derivatives of integrals to reconstruct various types of graphs, to sketch graphs of possible formulas. And what you do is you look at the zeros, boom, boom, those are your boundary conditions. So if you think of a graph, left side, right side, I know where the boundary conditions are and what it's doing there. And now all I need to do is figure out what it does between the two. Feynman looked at the parameters. Okay, what are the conditions that must be satisfied? At the beginning of where I'm interested in studying it, it must be this. At the end of what I'm interested in studying, it must be this. And it does something in between the two. What is the one thing that it does between the two? You plot that, and then Feynman solved that problem, besting all of the supposed experts in the field, solving all of their problems. And he did it on a lark, on a whim. Let me just see what I can do with this. If you take it seriously and you really run with this idea, you can use Occam's razor, Einstein's razor, whichever formulation of it you happen to prefer. You can use it to cut away nonsense very quickly. It's one of the failings of modern schooling systems here in the West, is that it does not teach logic as it should, and doesn't teach statistics and probability the way that it should, focusing on teaching people algebra and geometry, for example, which are important. As a mathematician, obviously I think those are extremely important, but as a practical everyday endeavor, it's going to be more useful for people to have a good understanding of probability and statistics and logic than being able to sit there and do really fancy things with some circles and some various postulates. Just real world, trying to get through your life. You don't need to know trigonometry by and large, and you don't need to know geometry by and large. You need to understand probability and statistics, because your failure to know it is how you are lied to very, very frequently by people who should know better, but because reality is too inconvenient to their political narratives, can't be much asked to do the hard intellectual work of being honest. I digress. Take it away.
So when we use words to describe adult women that are typically used to describe children, it changes the way we view women, even...
Typically, but not exclusively, and no, it doesn't choose the way that we view women. It may change the way that you view women, which I doubt, because I watched a video about you and your son where he was playing the violin. By the way, really good with the instruments. Good job there. And you're talking about raising him and how it's important to play with your kids, and that's the kind of girl that you are. You didn't seem to have any confusion there, that you are simultaneously deserving of respect, strong, blah, 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 equal dignity, all this other stuff, while simultaneously being able to engage in that activity, which is curious, given something that you're going to say in a little while, which is related to the psychological fallacy, which I earlier mentioned, and let's let you get to it.
Unconsciously, so that we don't equate them with adult men. In fact, it implies that they're inferior to men.
No, that's what you feel. It is not what is implied by the proposition. When I'm called a boy, which does happen, I don't think, oh my God, I'm being denigrated. Now, it's possible to use it that way to highlight the fact that a person is being immature or having some trait about childhood that you tend to outgrow. But the interesting thing here is that when I look at a child and I see a little girl or a little boy running around being little girls and little boys doing whatever, I don't think, my word, there is an inferior creature to me. You, on the other hand, project and think, this is a sign of inferiority. Being a woman or a girl is not an inferior state of affairs to being a man or a boy. I'm sorry that you feel that way and that you need to project your feelings onto the remainder of society. But the fact that you feel that way does not map on to reality. And it's interesting here to talk about maps and terrain because it's useful, particularly given this linguistic notion of bullshit that you were trying to feed us earlier. When I was in the Army and when I was in law enforcement and someone was lost and we couldn't find out where they were, one of the jokes was just have them shake a tree while I look on the map and then I'll go locate them. Because the joke there is obvious, and you come up with silly shit when you're out in the field for 2 weeks and you don't have anything else to do, so you find weird ways to view the world. And it's because a map and a terrain are two different things. Maps are supposed to map terrain, and terrain is supposed to be reflected on a map. But of course we all know that not every map perfectly maps the terrain it's supposed to, because they go out of date, things are changed, and there's a disconnect between the map and the terrain. And if you confuse the one for the other, you're in a world of hurt. In the same way that the punchline of that joke, the unstated punchline of that joke is, if you confuse the ability to shake a tree with changing what happens on the map, these people who require to be rescued because they're lost are going to be fucked. Best of luck to you. I hope you have good survival skills, because we're too stupid to figure out how to get to you, because we think that if you shake a tree in the real world, that, like an Etch-a-Sketch, changes the map. It doesn't work that way, which is the fundamental problem with these linguistic categories being in some sense determinative of what it is that we think, how we view the world and behaviors in which we engage. It's just not true. We have behaviors that predate the existence of language, and therefore language cannot logically be at all causally related to those behaviors. We still engage in those behaviors. Their origin predates the existence of language, and therefore is not controlled by it. There may be some, there may, and this is just a really gracious undertaking on my part to grant you that there's validity to this at all, there may be some circles in which linguistic categories are, in fact, a contributing factor to how we view the world, or the behaviors in which we engage. And that's a very great sense of largesse on my part. You are welcome. That is the problem there, though. Do not confuse a map for its terrain.
Even if that's not what most people intend, words have an impact on our unconscious. Case in point, you would never say to someone, go ask that boy behind the bank counter if the notary's here today. We never...
Well, I might not actually say that, because when I go to my bank, the notaries don't sit behind bank counters, but that's just a different... that's a mere detail. What I do remember is when, say, I don't know, the United States, Canada, and some other countries were storming the beaches